There are many creepy places in the world, but few of the horrors that they contain are as scary as radiation. You can't fight it. You can't outrun it. And you sure as hell can't ignore it. Once a place becomes nuclear, it doesn't matter how many hazmat suits you've got or how carefully you clean it, radiation stays. It seeps into the ground, the air, the bones of everything around it, not for hundreds but for thousands of years. Here are 15 of the most radioactive places on Earth, and the stories behind them. Number 15, Siberian Chemical Combine Plant. The Siberian Chemical Combine was never designed with safety in mind. It was built during the golden age of Soviet just wing-it engineering. Located deep in Siberia, this uranium enrichment plant dumped radioactive liquid waste straight into underground water reservoirs. As if that wasn't reckless enough, in 1993 things got worse. A massive explosion tore through part of the complex, ripping open a storage tank filled with plutonium, uranium, and other toxic nightmares. The radioactive gas released contaminated 77 square miles of surrounding land. And if the wind had shifted slightly, cities like Tomsk and Seversk would have been wiped off the map. Cleanup took 4 brutal months, but that was just the beginning. Turns out there had been 22 accidents at this one facility alone. Even in its safe years, the SCC was leaking around 10 grams of plutonium into the air annually, and a millionth of a gram is enough to mess up your body for life. Number 14, Chernobyl. You can't talk about history's worst radiation disasters without saying the name Chernobyl. The 1986 explosion at this Ukrainian nuclear plant is still the worst nuclear disaster in human history. First responders were hit hard by acute radiation syndrome, but the worst part is that it wasn't just them. The nearby town of Pripyat wasn't evacuated for 36 hours, and by then the damage was already done. People were getting sick. And still, the Soviet response was silence. They tried to keep it quiet, until radiation alarms in Sweden went off and exposed the truth to the entire world. Officially, 31 people died from the immediate disaster, but we all know that these numbers are just made up. In reality, the long-term fallout is much harder to measure. Cancer rates in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia spiked. At least 6,000 thyroid cancer cases have been loosely tied to radiation. But how many others were affected, no one really knows. Chernobyl left behind a radioactive ghost, and it's still haunting. It can't be habited for 2,000 years. Number 13, the Somali coast. This place is better known for pirates, but the real danger is buried beneath the waves. During the 1980s, Somalia collapsed into chaos. With no government, shady companies from around the world saw an opportunity, dumped their nuclear and toxic waste here. No questions asked, no regulations, no cleanup. Just barrels of radioactive sludge rolling into the sea. This nightmare stayed underwater until 2009 when a tsunami hit. Waves smashed open hundreds of rusted containers, sending radioactive and chemical contaminants surging inland, up to 6 miles. The aftermath was brutal. Locals reported everything from strange skin conditions to serious illnesses. Some experts believe even the groundwater was poisoned. The United Nations called it a serious crisis. But little has changed. To this day, no one knows exactly how much waste is buried there, or how deep the contamination goes. What's clear is that Somalia didn't become radioactive. It was made radioactive by greed, corruption, and the world looking the other way. Number 12, the Hanford site. Back in the 1940s, Hanford, Washington was the crown jewel of the US nuclear program. Built for the Manhattan Project, it churned out plutonium for atomic bombs, but every kilogram came with hundreds of thousands of gallons of radioactive waste. The plan, store it temporarily, underground. Decades passed. The waste stayed. The tanks cracked. Radiation leaked into the soil. By the time anyone looked close, Hanford was a disaster zone hiding in plain sight. The Atomic Energy Commission never even had a dedicated office for waste disposal. Toxic sludge ended up buried in rotting containers, some without proper labeling. Hanford became the largest nuclear cleanup site in the Western Hemisphere. The cleanup has dragged on for decades, racked up billions in costs, and sickened dozens of workers. In 2017, during demolition, 42 people were exposed despite strict precautions. The plant meant to treat the waste still unfinished. Hanford's legacy isn't just history, it's an ongoing nuclear headache with no clear end. Number 11. The polygon. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Kazakhstan finally stood on its own, one of the first things it did was slam the door shut on the polygon. For over 40 years, this pretty desolate corner of Kazakhstan was ground zero for Soviet nuclear testing. Roughly 25% of the world's nuclear detonations happened right here. Well, these dudes were crazy. Now here's where it gets a little bit scary. It was supposed to be empty, but no one seemed to care that villages sat just beyond the perimeter. For decades, nuclear hell rained down, and the so-called safe zones became breeding grounds for birth defects, cancer, and long-term radiation sickness. Today, over 100,000 Kazakh citizens still suffer from radiation-related illnesses caused by those tests. The land is still toxic. The radiation levels here won't even begin to normalize for hundreds of years. And the human cost, it won't stop with one generation. Experts believe it could echo through 5 or more. The polygon isn't just a scar, it's a radioactive curse written into the DNA of a nation. Number 10. Sellafield. Sellafield is to Britain what Chernobyl is to Ukraine, except somehow even more British in its chaos. In 1957, the Windscale No. 1 reactor caught fire, burning through 11 tons of uranium for 3 straight days. The government's response was nothing, and there were no evacuations or public warnings. Workers weren't even told there was a fire, they were told to just carry on. Meanwhile, radioactive clouds were drifting across the countryside. Then came Thomas Tuhey, a deputy general manager who showed up on his day off, threw away his radiation badge so no one could track his exposure, and climbed an 80-foot reactor stack multiple times. When things got critical, Tuhey took a wild gamble. He ordered water dumped directly onto the reactor, even though no one knew if that would trigger an explosion. It didn't. The blaze died after 30 hours of dousing, and Sellafield survived. But the region was left irradiated, from the cows to the chickens to the milk. Tuhey survived too. He died at night. Well, that's why we hate nuke stuff. Number 9. Mayak. Long before Chernobyl, the Soviet Union had another nuclear stuff, Mayak. Built after WWL in the Ural Mountains, this ultra-secret facility produced plutonium for weapons and dumped waste like it was going out of style. No safety, no oversight, no public knowledge. Then came a cooling system failure caused a huge explosion, launching radioactive debris into the sky and contaminating 7,700 square miles. Over 270,000 people were exposed, but no one was warned. The disaster, later called the Kishtim explosion, was covered up for decades. Villagers kept living in toxic zones, getting sick and dying early. When the truth finally came out in the 90s, it was too late. But it wasn't until 2009 that people living closest to the disaster were relocated. And even then, they were just moved a mile down the road. Now, Mayak is still one of the most radioactive places on Earth. One of the best-kept open secrets of the Soviet nuclear machine. Number 8. Church Rock Uranium Mill. In 1979, the Church Rock Uranium Mill in New Mexico suffered a devastating spill that dumped 1,100 tons of radioactive tailings and 94 million gallons of contaminated water into the Puerco River. The toxic mix flowed nearly 50 miles downstream, releasing 3 times more radiation than the infamous 3 Mile Island incident. It remains the largest accidental radioactive release in U.S. history. Water, animals, soil, everything it touched became tainted, and the Navajo people living nearby still bear the brunt, with increased cases of birth defects and kidney disease tied to long-term exposure. What makes this even worse is that it was completely preventable. The dam holding the waste failed on unstable rock. The company and inspectors had already flagged as unsafe, yet nothing changed. Until it broke. Now the environment suffers, the people suffer, and the land remembers what corporate negligence tried to bury. Church Rock wasn't just a spill, It was a radioactive betrayal wrapped in silence. Number 7. Fukushima. On March 11, 2011, a massive earthquake shifted Japan's entire landmass eastward. What followed was a tsunami that swept through the coast, killing over 19,000 people, and triggering Japan's worst nuclear crisis. The Fukushima Daiichi plant initially seemed stable. The reactors had shut down, but the tsunami had a final trick up its sleeve. It crippled the cooling systems. Within 3 days, 3 reactors had melted down. A fourth showed signs of collapse. The government ordered 100,000 people to evacuate. Engineers scrambled to prevent radioactive leaks, using seawater to cool the reactors. The plant sits just 100 yards from the ocean, and its vulnerability to future disasters remains an urgent concern. The real challenge was cleanup. Radiation levels are still so high that no one can safely enter. Robots now explore the plant, trying to map out where the molten fuel is buried. Experts estimate decades of cleanup ahead. Fukushima isn't just a disaster, it's a warning written in fallout. Alright guys, now let's move to number 6. Aberdeenshire. Aberdeenshire isn't the kind of place you'd expect radiation alerts from. No nuclear reactors, no atomic test zones, just rolling hills and castles. But in 2012, things got weird. Over 2,000 radon testing kits were sent out after 800 homes were flagged for elevated radiation levels. The culprit, radon. It's a naturally radioactive gas that seeps from rocks and soil, totally invisible and completely odorless, but not harmless. This gas settles in homes and then turns into radioactive dust that people unknowingly breathe in. Over time, that stuff collects in your lungs like a silent threat. Health officials link high radon levels to over 1,000 deaths annually in the UK alone. And here's the kicker. Aberdeenshire isn't alone. Radon can be anywhere, but when it shows up in clusters like this, it's a big red flag. What looked like a quiet countryside became a hot zone, and not the kind you sunbathe in. Number 5. Ramsar. Ramsar looks like a peaceful coastal town, beaches, mineral springs, scenic Caspian Sea views. But here's the twist. It's one of the most naturally radioactive places on Earth. And no, it's not because of a meltdown or a secret weapons lab. It's the water. Seriously. The region's famous hot springs are loaded with radium, specifically radium-226. And it's not just in the water, it's in the walls of homes, the air people breathe, and even the spa treatments tourists soak in. Now, we're not saying people are glowing in the dark here, but Ramsar's radiation levels exceed global safety standards. It's all background radiation, but in very high doses. So even though there aren't mass cancer outbreaks or mutant fish yet, long-term exposure here isn't exactly ideal. Scientists monitor it closely, and some locals have even been moved or given cleanup aid. Moral of the story, even natural beauty can hide invisible threats. Number 4. Zabatny Mining and Chemical Combine. This place wasn't designed to be a hazard, it just became one. The Zabatny Mining and Chemical Combine in Milusu, Kyrgyzstan, was a Soviet-era uranium mine. Not a test site, not a reactor, just straight-up excavation. The area's naturally rich in uranium, and during the Cold War, that made it a gold mine, if gold was radioactive. Uranium ore was pulled in massive quantities and sent off to fuel nuclear weapons. But what didn't get used? A whole lot of radioactive waste. Some was buried, a lot was dumped. And here's where it gets dicey. This region's prone to earthquakes and landslides, so those safely buried toxins, they don't stay buried. The contaminants are dangerously close to rivers that thousands rely on for water. If one of those buried tailing dams ruptures, the consequences wouldn't just hit the town, it'd ripple across the entire region. It's less of a ghost from the Cold War and more of a radioactive time bomb. Number 3. Goiânia, radiological disaster. Imagine stealing scrap metal and accidentally unleashing a radiation nightmare. That's exactly what happened in Goiânia, Brazil in 1987. Two men broke into an abandoned clinic and hauled off a teletherapy machine without realizing it was housing a highly radioactive capsule of cesium. They cracked it open thinking they'd scored valuable parts. Instead, they exposed themselves and eventually an entire neighborhood to lethal radiation. Kids played with the glowing powder. Families unknowingly tracked it home. Within weeks, 4 people were dead. Over 250 others were contaminated. The cleanup? Massive. Whole homes had to be demolished. Topsoil was removed by the truckload. The International Atomic Energy Agency still calls it one of the worst radiological incidents ever caused by civilians. And here's the wild part. It wasn't a bomb, it wasn't a power plant, just one stolen medical device in the wrong hands. Proof that radiation doesn't need a warhead to cause irreversible damage. Number 2. Fort d'Iberville. France is known for wine, cheese, and art, but Fort d'Iberville near Paris holds something far less charming. Radioactive contamination that's been brewing since it started with Irène and Frédéric Joliot-Curie, Marie Curie's daughter and her husband, who carried on the radioactive legacy by conducting experiments with radium-2. But then the military joined in. The fort became a testing site tied to France's nuclear ambitions. In Algeria, over time, the place turned toxic. For decades, nothing was done. It wasn't until the 1990s that cleanup began. More than 60 barrels of radioactive material and over 160,000 gallons of tainted soil had to be removed. But the damage had already been done. Locals in surrounding areas began reporting higher rates of cancer, prompting investigations and panic. What started as science turned into a legacy of contamination. It's not a historic site you visit unless you're wearing a hazmat suit. Number 1. Malusu. Malusu, Kyrgyzstan, lives in the long, radioactive shadow of Soviet ambition. Locals half-joke that they need the radiation to survive. Some even offer guided tours through decaying nuclear dump sites, followed by vodka, of course. The area once served as a Soviet uranium hub. Over 2 million cubic meters of waste sit buried barely across 23 dumping sites. Some are scattered piles marked by a half-hearted fence, others barely covered in crumbling concrete. It's not just history, it's still active and dangerously unstable. The biggest threat? Geography. The dumps sit next to the Malusu River, a vital water source for 2 million people. Even worse, the region is landslide-prone and tectonically active. In 1992, one landslide cracked a waste site wide open, dumping 1,000 cubic meters of radioactive material straight into the river. Malusu isn't just a relic, it's a ticking time bomb, where radiation waits beneath the soil, one disaster away from poisoning half a nation's water supply. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you very soon in the next one.